My future sister-in-law poured a glass of red wine down my white dress and hissed that I was a cheap nobody ruining her party. My own brother turned his back while his mother-in-law dragged me to the kitchen like trash. They thought I was nothing. But they didn't know that in 3 minutes, I'd kill the music, slam on the lights, and announce to every guest, this wedding is over. Because I'm not just a guest. I own this estate, and I've just cancelled their contract. You really shouldn't have come. The stench of your cheap clothes is ruining the air. Those were the last words my brother's fiancée whispered to me before she deliberately emptied a glass of aged Cabernet down the front of my cream silk dress. The music seemed to stumble and die. Around us, the chatter of the wedding party vanished into a collective gasp. Sienna stood there, a practiced smirk on her face, waiting for me to shatter. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted the drama of a humiliated, poor relation. I gave her exactly 3 minutes. I didn't reach for a napkin, and I didn't try to blot the stain. I simply looked down at my watch. It was 6:02 p.m. By 6:05, I decided this entire celebration would legally cease to exist. I stood perfectly still, feeling the cold weight of the wine soaking through the fabric to my skin. The guests were leaning in, hungry for the breakdown. They wanted to see the charity case run away in tears, broken by the golden couple. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Sienna let out a light, melodic laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. She snapped her fingers at a passing server without even glancing his way. Get her some club soda and a cloth, though I doubt it will save that fabric. It looks like it's mostly polyester anyway. She dismissed me with a flick of her wrist, turning back to her bridesmaids to bask in their shallow sympathy. That was when Patricia, my brother's future mother-in-law, stepped in. Patricia was a veteran HR director at a tech firm in Denver. She spent her days managing people, which usually meant weeding them out. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin with surprising force. "Let's get you out of the line of sight," she hissed, her smile as stiff as her Botox. "We can't have you looking like a murder victim in the background of the first dance." She marched me away from the head table, past the hand-carved ice sculptures and the floor-to-ceiling views of the Rocky Mountains. We walked past the open bar and the mahogany tables, all the way to the swinging stainless steel doors of the kitchen. She shoved me toward a small, rickety folding table tucked in a dark corner, the graveyard for the vendors. The DJ was there, chewing on a dry turkey sandwich. The photographer was busy swapping a memory card. This was where the help was kept. "Stay here," Patricia commanded, smoothing her silk gown. "And try not to speak to anyone of importance. We're doing you a favor just by letting you stay." I sat down. Across the ballroom, I saw my brother, Julian. He was standing 10 feet away, a glass of crystal-clear champagne in his hand. He had watched his fiancée drench me. He had watched his mother-in-law drag me away like a stray dog. He caught my eye, took a slow sip of his drink, and turned his back. In that moment, the last flicker of sadness died. It was replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I looked at Sienna, glowing under the chandeliers. Most people would see a mean girl having a bad day, but I saw the predator's arithmetic. Bullies like her don't strike at random, they do the math. When she walked into this lodge, she felt small. She was marrying into a legacy she hadn't earned, at a venue she couldn't afford, surrounded by people she felt inferior to. She was insecure. So, she scanned the room for a resource to consume to bolster herself. She saw me. She saw the simple dress I'd found at a vintage shop because I didn't care for labels. She saw the quiet sister who never raised her voice. She calculated that I was the path of least resistance. By destroying me publicly, she wasn't just being cruel, she was establishing dominance. She was showing everyone that she was the alpha and I was the floor mat. It was a primitive, brutal equation of power. But Sienna made a fatal error in her calculations. She assumed that silence meant weakness. She assumed that sitting at the vendor table made me a servant. She forgot that in the world of high-end hospitality, the vendor table is the most dangerous seat in the house. That's where the people who actually run the show sit. I picked up a linen napkin from the table. I didn't use it for the wine. I simply smoothed it over my lap and watched the scarf move. My scarf. I checked my watch again. 6:04 p.m. Time to balance the books. As I sat in the shadows of the kitchen doors, watching Julian raise a toast to his beautiful, vicious bride, I realized they saw me as a failure. A sister who couldn't afford a designer label. A girl who had settled for a small, quiet life while they chased the sun. They had no idea they were standing on my dirt. I don't work as an assistant, and I don't work in hospitality management. I specialize in distressed commercial real estate. I hunt for dying assets, mountain resorts drowning in debt, historic hotels on the brink of foreclosure, properties that banks are desperate to dump. I buy them for pennies on the dollar, and then I rebuild them. I bought Blackwood Lodge 2 years ago when it was nothing but a crumbling liability and a series of lawsuits. I turned it into the most exclusive destination in the state. I never told them. I kept my mouth shut and drove my old car because I knew exactly who they were. I knew that if Julian knew I had money, he wouldn't see a sister, he would see a line of credit. I watched Sienna spin in the center of the dance floor, her white train sweeping across the polished hardwood I had paid to restore. She looked radiant. She looked expensive. And suddenly, the invisible ledger opened in my mind. It's a specific kind of accounting only the family scapegoat understands. I looked at the crystal flutes in their hands, overflowing with vintage bubbly. I remembered sitting in my studio apartment 3 years ago, wearing 2 sweaters because I couldn't afford to turn on the heat. I was eating instant noodles for the 20th night in a row, not because I was broke, but because I had just wired $1,000 to our parents to stop the bank from taking their home. I lived in the cold so they could sleep in the warm. I looked at Julian laughing as he loosened his silk tie. I remembered the day he started his business. He needed seed money. My father called me, begging. I emptied my savings account, money I had set aside for a down payment on my own life, and sent it to him. I drove a car with a taped-up window for 2 years so Julian could drive a BMW to his client meetings. I looked back at Sienna, sneering at the staff, judging the world from her borrowed throne. She saw a stain. I saw the price of their survival. I realized then that my silence hadn't been humility. It had been a mistake. I had starved myself to feed people who would mock me for being hungry. I had built a kingdom in the dark to protect them, and they used those very shadows to hide me away. The ledger was full. The debt was due. I pulled my phone from my clutch. I didn't open a messaging app or look at the photos from the ceremony. Instead, I logged into the internal management system for Blackwood Lodge. I saw the event status, active. I saw the names on the digital file, Julian and Sienna. I scrolled down to the contract section. I didn't need to read the fine print. I was the one who had drafted it. Clause 14b, the Professional Conduct and Harassment Protocol. It was a specific protection I had added to every rental agreement after a particularly entitled groom had laid hands on a server the previous summer. It gave ownership the unilateral right to terminate any event, effective immediately, if the client or their guests harassed, abused, or physically struck the staff or management. Sienna had just doused the owner in wine. I looked toward the main exit. Silas, my head of security, was leaning against the stone pillar, looking distinctly bored. He was a mountain of a man, former specialized infantry, and he didn't miss a thing. I sent him a 3-word text, code 14B. Immediate. Silas glanced at his phone. His head snapped up, his eyes finding me in the shadows of the kitchen door. He didn't hesitate. He tapped his earpiece and began moving toward the stage with a predator's grace. I stood up from the rickety folding table. I didn't bother smoothing my dress or trying to hide the stain. I walked past the photographer, ignored the confused DJ, and stepped up onto the stage. The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead. I climbed the 3 steps to the raised platform where the DJ was queuing up a pop hit. He saw me, a woman drenched in red wine with a look of absolute zero in her eyes, and opened his mouth to tell me to get lost. He never got the chance. Silas stepped out of the periphery. He simply nodded at the DJ and cut the master power. The music died with a sharp, electronic screech that made half the room wince. Then, the house lights slammed on at full brightness, harsh, clinical, and unforgiving. The romantic, amber glow of the ballroom vanished, replaced by the stark reality of a high-end conference center. "Hey!" Sienna shrieked from the dance floor, shielding her eyes against the glare. "Who turned on the lights?" "DJ, what is going on?" I took the microphone from the stand. It gave a high-pitched whine of feedback that forced the guests to cover their ears. "His following orders," I said. My voice boomed through the overhead speakers, steady and cold. "And so are you." Sienna spun around, her eyes narrowing to slits when she saw me standing center stage. "You." She let out a nervous, jagged laugh. "Oh my God, she's actually drunk. Someone get this wine-soaked embarrassment off the stage before she ruins the night further." Patricia marched toward the platform, her face twisted into the same expression she used right before handing someone a severance package. "Get down from there this instant, you little brat," she hissed, reaching for my hem. "I will have you banned from this entire property." "Actually, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through hers. "You can't ban the person who signs the checks." I held up my phone, the screen glowing with the digital contract. "I am invoking Clause 14B of the Venue Rental Agreement, the Morality and Professional Conduct Protocol." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "What is she talking about?" Someone whispered near the front. Clause 14B states that any physical or verbal harassment directed at the ownership or the facility staff is grounds for immediate, non-refundable termination of the event, I recited from memory. I looked directly at Sienna. "You poured wine on me. You mocked my clothes. You used this room to humiliate me for sport." "So what?" Sienna yelled back, her hands on her hips, her composure beginning to fray. "You're just Julian's loser sister. You aren't Starf." "No," I corrected her. "I'm not Starf. I am the owner." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. Sienna blinked, her mouth falling open, but no sound came out. Patricia froze mid-step. Across the floor, Julian dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood, but no one looked down. "I bought Blackwood Lodge 2 years ago," I continued. "I rebuilt this place from the ground up. Every chair you're sitting in, every glass you're holding, the very floor beneath your feet, it belongs to me. And I have a zero-tolerance policy for bullies." I gestured to the exits, where 6 uniformed security guards had suddenly materialized, arms crossed, blocking the way. Sienna, Patricia, Julian, you have violated the terms of your contract. This event is terminated, effective immediately. You have 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. I lowered the microphone just enough to add. If you are still on the property at 6:20 p.m., I will have the sheriff escort you out for trespassing. The clock is ticking. The room didn't just erupt, it detonated. Sienna shrieked and lunged toward the stage, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. You liar! She screamed, her voice cracking with rage. You pathetic, jealous loser. You're broke and trying to sabotage my wedding because you have nothing. Patricia was right behind her, her face a mask of corporate fury. I've spent 20 years in human resources, girl. I know what real power looks like. I'll have you blacklisted from every venue in this state. I'll make sure you never work in this town again. I stood my ground, watching high society dissolve into a shouting match. Then Julian moved. He stepped onto the stage and ripped the microphone from my hand. He didn't look angry, he looked concerned. It was the same look of calculated pity he used whenever he wanted to manipulate our parents. Don't listen to her, Julian shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. My sister isn't well. He turned to the crowd, his voice softening into a tone of false, tragic sympathy. She's been off her medication. She came to me just last week begging for rent money because she couldn't keep a job. She's delusional, and it kills her to see anyone else happy. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The shock turned into pity for him and disgust for me. I could see the guests whispering, shaking their heads at the unstable sister who had finally snapped. Security, Julian barked, pointing at me. Get her out of here before she hurts herself or someone else. Even Silas and his men hesitated for a fraction of a second. Julian was the golden child, the successful entrepreneur. I was suddenly just a girl in a stained dress who had lost her grip on reality. I turned to walk away, but Julian stepped in front of the exit, blocking my path. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive gin. You're broke, Meyer, he sneered, his voice a low hiss. And tonight, I'm going to tell everyone exactly where you've been hiding your failures. He believed his own lie. He believed it because her father had lied to him for years to protect Julian's ego and keep the peace. You really believe that? I asked quietly. I know it, he whispered. Let go of my arm, Julian, I warned him. Or I'll start the foreclosure tonight. He faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. I didn't wait for him to process the word. I walked back to the DJ booth and synced my phone to the massive projector screen behind the stage. Julian and Sienna's engagement photos vanished. In their place appeared a scanned deed of trust. Borrower, Thomas and Martha Sterling. Lender, Blackwood Assets, LLC. Status, delinquent. The room went silent again, but this time it was a vacuum, as if the air had been sucked out of the building. I didn't beg Dad for rent money, Julian, I said, my voice amplified by the house speakers. I bought his mortgage when he begged me to save the house from the bank. I swiped the screen. A second document appeared. It was Julian's primary business loan, the one that had funded his latest startup. Status, 90 days past due. Julian went pale, the blood draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. You're the silent investor? I am the lender, I replied. I paid for your office space. I paid for your car. I paid for the ring on Sienna's finger, and I paid for this venue. I pulled up the master ledger for the room to see. 6 figures of unpaid debts stared back at the guests. I don't pay rent because I own the roof you live under. Silence. Absolute and total. You have until Monday morning to offer a sincere apology for tonight, I said, lowering the volume but keeping the intensity. Or I file the foreclosure papers on the house and the business assets. Julian didn't say a word. He turned and ran toward the side exit, dragging a sobbing Sienna with him. Patricia tried to bluster, but Silas and his team stepped forward, and she was swiftly escorted out into the cold mountain air. The guests stared at me differently now. I wasn't the girl in the ruined dress anymore. I was the woman holding the deed to their dreams. I walked over to the bar, poured myself a single glass of the vintage Cabernet, and savored the quiet. I had spent my life building a kingdom in the shadows to keep them safe, and they had tried to use those very shadows to bury me. I blocked Julian's number. Then Patricia's. Then my father's. They could stay in the house for now, but only because I allowed it. They would live every day under a roof built by my money, not my shame. The debt may remain on the books, but the relationship is foreclosed. Sometimes, power isn't a gift. It's an acquisition.